Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. In the wizarding world, the name Percy Weasley more often sparks irritation than admiration. He's strict, ambitious, sometimes even unbearably pompous, and for that he's harshly criticized. But have you ever wondered why Percy ended up in the role of the misunderstood one? Maybe there's more behind his actions than meets the eye. Let's figure out why this Weasley brother deserves more understanding than ridicule. Enjoy the video. Number 1, we only saw him through Harry's eyes. From the very beginning, Percy Weasley's story was presented to us through a biased lens. Harry trusted Ron's and the twins' opinion, who considered their brother a bore, arrogant and unbearable. Only at the climax of the final book do we see Percy differently. Brave, ready to admit his mistakes, and return to his family. But until that moment, readers couldn't help but share the protagonist's perspective, which meant treating Percy unfairly. Number 2, his ambitions were never encouraged. Percy was a driven young man, but in the Weasley family, that trait was constantly mocked. Prefect, top grades, a job under Barty Crouch. All of these achievements were highly valued in the wizarding world, yet instead of support, he was met with laughter. Even Harry joined in the fun when Fred and George made jokes at Percy's expense. In the end, Percy grew up in an atmosphere where his persistence and career goals weren't seen as strengths, but as reasons for mockery. Number 3, Molly defended him, but never favored him. Many believed Molly Weasley clearly favored Percy, but the reality was different. She defended him not because he was her favorite, but because the rest of the family mocked him. Harry noticed that only Molly took pride in his accomplishments while the others laughed. Yet Percy never took advantage of her support. He was simply a child searching for a bit of recognition. Number 4, no one explained the Order's motives to him. When the war broke out, and his parents openly declared that the ministry couldn't be trusted, Percy found himself at a crossroads. His family demanded that he give up everything he had worked for and just follow them. But he was given no explanation. No one told him in detail what the members of the Order had sacrificed. No one shared with him the horrors of the past. For a young and ambitious wizard, the vague demand to just trust us sounded far too uncertain. So it's hardly surprising he chose the ministry. Number 5. He cared for his family even as he lost them. Despite the coldness in his relationships, Percy cared about his loved ones. In the Goblet of Fire, he tried to pull Ron out of the lake during the task, kept an eye on his brother's safety, and even looked out for Harry. He tried to cheer Ginny up. But none of this was taken seriously. His care was dismissed as nagging, his genuine attention as tiresome fussing. Percy ended up being someone who loved his family, but remained a stranger to them. Number 6, he was loyal to rules, not to evil. Percy's loyalty was never to cruelty or darkness. It was to the rules that shaped his world. When the ministry declared that Dumbledore was lying about Voldemort's return in Order of the Phoenix, Percy chose to believe them. To his family, it looked like betrayal. But in truth, Percy clung to the system because it promised order. "The ministry is stable and secure," he wrote to Ron, urging him to distance himself from Harry. It was not malice, it was fear. Chaos terrified Percy more than authority ever could. Even his coldest decisions can be read through this lens. Working for Cornelius Fudge, obeying Bartemius Crouch, distancing himself from the Burrow, all of it was Percy holding on to the belief that rules could protect him. Others saw blind obedience. Percy saw safety. In his mind, law was the only shield against the rising storm. That choice did not make him a villain. It made him a frightened young man who believed too much in the structure of a crumbling institution. Number 7, he was mocked for traits that were praised in others. Hermione Granger was praised for her relentless drive. Her hand shot up in every class, her essays were always perfect, and professors adored her diligence. "Miss Granger, 5 points to Gryffindor," was a phrase repeated again and again. Yet when Percy Weasley displayed the same love of order and achievement, he was branded pompous. His prefect's badge, which should have been a mark of pride, became the butt of his brother's jokes. The same hunger for excellence that earned Hermione admiration earned Percy ridicule. The contrast was striking during their years at Hogwarts. When Hermione reminded Harry and Ron to study or follow the rules, it was treated as endearing, even if annoying. But when Percy enforced rules in the Gryffindor common room, the twins groaned and mocked him. "He's like a ministry leaflet come to life," Fred joked. It was unfair, for Percy was only asking for the same discipline that made Hermione beloved by teachers and respected by classmates. This double standard wounded Percy deeply. He was doing nothing different from Hermione, working hard, excelling and respecting the system. But while she was rewarded with praise and respect, he was cast as the family bore. His ambition and discipline could have been seen as strengths, but in the eyes of his siblings they became flaws. Percy never escaped that shadow, and it hardened him into the very role they had written for him. Number 8, his successes were not taken seriously. Percy's achievements should have been celebrated, but instead they became a running joke. When he secured a position as Bartemius Crouch's assistant in Goblet of Fire, it was a remarkable step for someone so young. He organized documents, handled official correspondence, and earned the trust of one of the most powerful men in the ministry. Yet Fred and George dismissed it with a sneer. "Weatherby, fetch us some tea," they joked, turning his hard work into mockery. What others would call success, his own family treated as vanity. Even his appointment as head boy was undermined. Harry noted in Prisoner of Azkaban that Percy had been bursting with importance all summer, strutting with his badge. But behind that strut was pride born of struggle. Percy had no dragon-taming exploits like Charlie or curse-breaking adventures like Bill. His victories came from long nights of study, from discipline and persistence. Still, instead of respect, he was met with eye rolls and laughter. For Percy, every step forward was a climb out of his brother's shadows, and the higher he climbed, the more ridicule followed. His desire to prove himself was never arrogance, it was survival. But because his achievements looked so different from the daring feats that the Weasley family admired, they were dismissed as empty pomp. In truth, Percy was building something no less impressive, a career forged entirely by his own determination. Number 9, he was denied the right to make mistakes. Percy Weasley made one terrible mistake, and it defined him for years. When he sided with the ministry against his family, he was branded a traitor. "You're no son of mine," his father thundered in Order of the Phoenix. From that moment, Percy was exiled. No letters, no forgiveness, no room to stumble and rise again. For others, mistakes were a path to growth. For Percy, they became a permanent sentence. Ron abandoned Harry and Hermione during their hunt for Horcruxes, but he was welcomed back with open arms. Sirius nearly got Snape killed as a schoolboy, and yet he was remembered with affection. Even Dumbledore admitted to youthful errors that endangered the world, and he was still revered. Percy, however, received no such mercy. His failure to trust his family was treated as irredeemable, a scar that would not fade until the final battle forced a reconciliation. The truth is that Percy's betrayal was born of fear, not malice. He was young, ambitious, and desperate to believe in a system that promised stability. When the ministry denied Voldemort's return, Percy clung to that lie because the alternative was too horrifying. His pride would not let him admit the possibility that his parents were right and his superiors were wrong. Was that foolish? Yes, but it was also deeply human. The tragedy lies in how long he was punished for it. By the time he returned at Hogwarts, he had endured years of silence from those he loved most. The label of traitor clung to him even as he stood on the same side, wand raised against Death Eaters. Percy's story reminds us that some characters are allowed redemption the moment they seek it, while others are forced to bleed for it until the very end. Number 10. He still proved his bravery. Percy Weasley returned when it mattered most. In Deathly Hallows, he walked back into the Great Hall, found his family, and asked for forgiveness. It was not an easy step. Pride had kept him away for years, yet he lowered his head and said, "I was a fool." That moment required more courage than any spell. To admit weakness in front of Fred and George, to face Molly's tears, and to own his mistakes was an act of Gryffindor bravery, as real as any duel. Then came the battle itself. Percy stood shoulder to shoulder with his family, fighting Death Eaters in the chaos of Hogwarts. He even faced his old boss, Pious Thickness, the puppet minister controlled by Voldemort. In a voice shaking with fury, Percy shouted, "Did I mention I'm resigning?" It was a defiant joke, perfectly timed in the middle of combat. For once, Percy wasn't the dull rule follower. He was a warrior, throwing off the chains of the ministry and standing with his blood. But bravery comes with heartbreak. In those final hours, Percy was at Fred's side. He laughed with his brother, finally sharing in the Weasley spirit. Moments later, Fred was killed. Percy's scream echoed in the rubble, and he refused to leave his brother's body. In that grief, readers glimpsed the depth of his love. The so-called cold Percy shattered, and what remained was simply a brother mourning a brother, as human and vulnerable as any of them. This was his redemption, though it is rarely remembered. Fans still call him pompous, a bore, a ministry lackey. But Percy fought in the last battle. He risked everything to come back. He held his dead brother and kept fighting through his tears. If courage means standing against fear, pain, and regret, then Percy proved he was Gryffindor to the core. Number 11, he always lived in the shadow of his brothers. Percy Weasley was the third son in a family where brilliance seemed effortless for everyone else. Bill was the dragon tamer, the cool curse breaker with a ponytail and fang earring. Charlie was the Quidditch star, admired for his daring and charm. Fred and George lit up every room with their jokes, making even professors laugh despite themselves. And Ron? He became the best friend of the boy who lived. In that crowded constellation, Percy's light was faint. He had no dragons, no jokes, no famous best friend. All he had were rules, books, and ambition. This shadow weighed heavily on him. When Percy became a prefect in Prisoner of Azkaban, his brothers laughed. Fred smirked. Percy's been acting the part of a prefect all his life. What should have been a proud moment was turned into a family punchline. Even his later promotion to head boy was met with more teasing than recognition. The achievement that would have made any other family beam with pride only reminded Percy that he was different, and different was not celebrated in the Burrow. It was no wonder he clung so tightly to his position in the ministry. Working under Bartemius Crouch gave him, at last, something that was his. Not Bill's adventure, not Charlie's dragons, not Fred and George's fireworks, not Ron's famous friendship. Just Percy and his career. "Weatherby," Crouch called him, forgetting his name, and even that humiliation was better than being invisible. For once, Percy was on a path that none of his brothers had walked before. The tragedy is that Percy's search for his own worth was seen as arrogance, but can anyone blame him for wanting to stand on his own? For a young man buried under the weight of brothers who seemed larger than life, ambition was not pride, it was survival. Percy did not wish to outshine them, he only wanted to be seen at all. And in that quiet struggle he is perhaps more human than any of his dazzling siblings. Number 12, his strictness was mistaken for coldness. Percy Weasley was often seen as cold, but in truth he was strict. He demanded order at Hogwarts, in his family, and in his work. People laughed at his seriousness, mistaking it for arrogance. Yet his need for discipline came from fear of chaos, not from a lack of love. Behind the polished prefect's badge and stiff posture stood a young man who thought rules could protect those he cared about. One moment shows this clearly. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, when Harry receives the firebolt, Percy warns that the broom could be dangerous. He sides with Professor McGonagall when she takes it away for inspection. To Harry and Ron, this looked like betrayal. Ron groaned, "Oh, Percy, for crying out loud!" But Percy believed he was doing the right thing. He wasn't trying to ruin Harry's joy. He was trying to keep his brother's best friend alive. At home, the same thing happened. Percy scolded Ron for not cleaning his prefect badge and reminded Ginny to finish her homework. The twins mocked him, calling him Perfect Percy. Even Molly sometimes sighed at his tone. But what looked like nagging was his way of watching over them. He had no jokes to offer, no pranks to soften his words, only reminders of rules and duties. It was the only language of care he knew. In the end, that so-called coldness was simply his shield. Percy feared that without order, the world would crumble around him. He had seen how quickly things could spiral out of control during the Triwizard Tournament and later in the war. His strictness was not a lack of warmth, it was his way of showing love. Few noticed it then, but the moment he returned to his family in the Battle of Hogwarts, fighting side by side with them, the truth became impossible to ignore. Number 13, he was an inconvenient hero. Of all the characters in J.K. Rowling's world, Percy Weasley is perhaps one of the most misunderstood. His story is not the tale of a reckless Gryffindor charging into battle, nor of a clever Slytherin plotting from the shadows. Percy's path is one of relentless diligence, ambition, and a deep, sometimes suffocating adherence to order. In the colourful chaos of Harry Potter's adventures, Percy became an outsider not because he lacked courage, but because he embodied a kind of heroism the wizarding world never celebrated. The heroism of discipline, of rules, of long hours spent ensuring the world functions while others bask in the glory. The injustice toward him begins when readers, shaped by Harry's perspective, learn to see Percy not as someone quietly carrying weight, but as an uncomfortable presence, too serious, too rigid, too correct. From the very first time Percy is introduced, he is painted with a caricature of pompousness. On the Hogwarts Express, he is the prefect in his shiny badge, proudly showing it off to his younger siblings. To Ron, to Harry, and to readers, this seems laughable, even pretentious. Fred and George ridicule him, calling him Weatherby in front of his boss later, mocking his endless reminders about rules. Yet if one steps back, what exactly was Percy guilty of in those moments? He was a young man proud of his achievements in a family where resources were scarce and recognition was hard to come by. The prefect badge symbolized not only status, but validation, that hard work could matter even for someone from a poor wizarding household. Harry, however, became the lens through which readers judged Percy, and Harry's preference for rebellious charm made Percy's seriousness look almost villainous. The contrast between Percy and the celebrated trio could not be sharper. Harry, Ron, and Hermione break rules almost as a reflex. They sneak into the restricted section, disobey curfews, and in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, they lie to professors to save the Philosopher's Stone. The narrative rewards them for these actions. Their disobedience is framed as bravery, cleverness, and loyalty to each other. Meanwhile, Percy's devotion to authority is portrayed as sycophantic. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when Percy enthusiastically speaks about his future in the ministry, he is mocked by his brothers and portrayed as insufferable. The underlying message is clear. The story leaves little room for a hero whose weapon is order, not rebellion. This bias becomes painfully visible during Goblet of Fire, when Percy loyally follows Bartemius Crouch's directives without question. His brothers find it hilarious that he refers to his superior as Mr. Crouch with such reverence, even though Percy is merely practicing the professionalism he believes will secure him a future. Readers are encouraged to laugh along. Yet Percy is doing exactly what society says one should do: respect authority, follow the chain of command, and earn advancement through merit. But Harry's story privileges those who reject authority, who break rules in pursuit of justice, and thus Percy's loyalty is recast as absurd devotion. The tragedy lies in the fact that Percy's diligence would have been celebrated in another context, yet in Harry's world it becomes a reason for mockery. The true fracture comes during the rise of Voldemort in Order of the Phoenix. Percy takes the Ministry's side, rejecting Dumbledore and distancing himself from his family. This is the moment where readers cement their dislike for him. But consider the situation through his eyes. Percy is a young man who has been told all his life to respect the Ministry, the cornerstone of wizarding order. He has been striving to prove himself, to rise above the shadow of poverty and the teasing of his siblings. When the Ministry insists that Dumbledore is lying and Harry is unstable, Percy makes the only choice that fits his worldview: to trust the institution he has worked so hard to join. The boy who keeps breaking rules and the headmaster who allows it look, to Percy, like chaos threatening the fragile stability of the wizarding world. His mistake was not in choosing evil, but in choosing order at the wrong time. Even Rowling herself frames Percy's decisions as betrayal, pushing readers to resent him. In Order of the Phoenix, Percy's letter to Ron warns him against associating with Harry and Dumbledore, urging him instead to focus on his own future. The language is stiff, cold, and almost cruel, but beneath it lies something heartbreaking. Percy is desperate for his family to see the world as he does, to value the path of safety and rules over reckless rebellion. When Ron tears the letter in anger, the narrative aligns us with Ron's indignation, and Percy becomes an enemy. Yet was he not acting from the same instinct that guided Molly Weasley when she clung to the idea of sending her children safely back to Hogwarts each September? Percy's tragedy is that his way of protecting himself and his family, by aligning with the Ministry, was incompatible with the story's glorification of resistance. It is worth asking why readers forgive characters like Severus Snape but not Percy Weasley. Snape is cruel, petty, and vindictive, yet he is hailed as a tragic hero because his suffering is romanticized through sacrifice and secret bravery. Percy, in contrast, suffers quietly in the margins. His loneliness, his break from his family, his isolation at the Ministry, all of it is real suffering, yet it is not framed with the same tragic nobility. Instead, it is painted as arrogance. One could argue that Percy's story mirrors a different kind of reality, how society punishes those who do not fit its image of the right kind of hero. Number 14, his mistakes were exaggerated. Of all the Weasley siblings, Percy Ignatius Weasley has remained the most misunderstood. He was ambitious, disciplined, and determined to make his own way in a world where his family's name was both loved and pitied. Yet when history remembers the Weasleys, Percy is the one draped in shadows, blamed for betrayal and pride, when in truth his single error has been magnified beyond proportion. Others committed greater mistakes, abandoned friends, or concealed secrets with devastating consequences, and they were eventually embraced with sympathy. Percy alone seems destined to bear a permanent stain, a mark of disloyalty that refuses to fade. When Percy broke with his family, siding with the Ministry of Magic against Harry and Dumbledore, the wound it caused was real. The Weasley family defined itself through unity, warmth, and loyalty, so Percy's departure felt like an act of treason. Molly wept, Arthur was shaken, and even the younger siblings felt betrayed. But one must pause and ask, how severe was Percy's sin compared to others in Harry's circle? He trusted the institution in which he worked, believed the leaders who had trained him, and obeyed authority. He was guilty of misplaced loyalty, not malice. His error was one of faith in the system, not hatred toward his family. Contrast Percy's choice with Ron Weasley, the very brother who later became a hero. During the quest for Horcruxes in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Ron abandoned Harry and Hermione in their darkest hour. He left his best friend and his love interest alone in a forest consumed by frustration and doubt. The narrative is clear. He stormed out of the tent. Hermione ran after him calling his name, but the door zipped shut behind him. For days, Harry and Hermione thought Ron might never return. His act endangered the entire mission, yet he was forgiven almost instantly when he came back. Harry clasped his hand, Hermione wept, and the bond was restored. Ron's abandonment, while excused as a moment of weakness, was more dangerous than Percy's political allegiance ever was. Sirius Black, revered as Harry's beloved godfather, also carried youthful sins far greater than Percy's. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Remus Lupin recalls how Sirius once endangered Severus Snape by luring him toward the entrance of the Shrieking Shack during a full moon. It was not a prank, but an act of reckless malice that could have killed Snape or revealed Remus's secret to the entire school. Dumbledore himself had to intervene, and Sirius's name could have been ruined forever. Yet Sirius, through charm and later through suffering, was redeemed in the eyes of the narrative. His betrayal of family expectations, he left the House of Black and mocked their traditions, became an emblem of defiance rather than disloyalty. Percy's estrangement from his family, born not from cruelty but from trust in his career, was not afforded the same romantic framing. Even Dumbledore, the paragon of wisdom and morality, concealed truths so heavy they altered the fate of generations. He withheld the prophecy from Harry until it was nearly too late, and his silence about Ariana's tragic death haunted his family forever. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Harry reads in Rita Skeeter's biography that Dumbledore once dreamed of wizard dominance with Gellert Grindelwald. For the greater good, they had promised, words that sound chilling when one knows what Grindelwald would become. Dumbledore's choices had the potential to devastate the entire magical world, yet he is forgiven because of his later sacrifices. Percy, whose sin was merely believing his superiors at the ministry, never found that grace in the eyes of his peers. The cruelty of Percy's treatment lies in how quickly his family cut him out of their lives. At Christmas, he did not sit at the table. During Bill's wedding, he was absent. While his siblings exchanged letters and support, Percy's name became almost taboo. Harry himself viewed Percy with scorn, perceiving him as arrogant and disloyal. And yet Harry had the power to shape the way others judged Percy. His forgiveness of Ron, his unwavering loyalty to Sirius, and his reverence for Dumbledore influenced everyone else. If Harry had extended even a fragment of that empathy toward Percy, perhaps history would have been kinder. Consider the atmosphere at the ministry when Percy worked there. Cornelius Fudge wielded fear, propaganda, and denial with ruthless efficiency. To doubt him was to risk one's career and reputation. Even Arthur Weasley, though skeptical, kept his position quietly. Percy, young and ambitious, trusted his leaders as so many employees in any government might do. He was fed the narrative that Harry was unstable and that Dumbledore was manipulating events for his own gain. The boy's disturbed, the Daily Prophet reported, and Percy absorbed this like countless others. Is he truly to be condemned for believing what was printed and reinforced daily, while older, wiser wizards also stumbled under that weight? The tragedy becomes sharper when one remembers that Percy's return was marked by humility and courage. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when the Battle of Hogwarts loomed, Percy came back to fight alongside his family. His words were heavy with regret. "I was an idiot. I was a pompous prat. I was a... And he never finished, for the fight had begun. This confession, so raw and unguarded, shows a man who had learned, who was ready to reconcile. Yet even this moment of bravery is overshadowed by the grief that followed. Fred's death, which struck just as Percy stood beside him again. For readers, Percy became forever linked to tragedy, his redemption swallowed by sorrow. Number 15, he proved that admitting guilt is strength. Of all the characters in the Harry Potter saga, Percy Weasley is perhaps one of the most misunderstood. The common perception of him is shaped by the arrogance he displayed in his rise at the Ministry of Magic and his painful estrangement from the rest of the Weasley family during the Second Wizarding War. Readers often remember him as the brother who turned his back on Arthur and Molly, who refused to stand with his siblings when their loyalty to Harry Potter became a point of conflict and who appeared consumed by ambition. Yet this image overshadows something deeper. Percy demonstrated a kind of courage that few others in the series were capable of, an inner strength that came not from spellwork or physical bravery, but from the ability to admit fault. Unlike many characters who stubbornly refused to acknowledge their own missteps, Percy returned to his family, apologized, and accepted the weight of his mistakes. His story is a powerful reminder that maturity is not about never erring, but about finding the strength to correct one's errors. The tension surrounding Percy intensified because of Harry Potter himself. Harry, in the eyes of the wizarding world, became a symbol of resistance, loyalty, and moral clarity. The Weasleys rallied around him, treating him not merely as a friend, but as family. Fred and George teased him like a brother. Ginny loved him openly. Ron fought by his side, and Arthur and Molly provided shelter and warmth that Harry had never known growing up. For Percy, however, Harry represented a dangerous conflict. Aligning with Harry meant opposing the Ministry of Magic, an institution Percy had worked tirelessly to serve and where he believed his future lay. In many ways, Percy's loyalty to the ministry made sense. He was young, ambitious, and deeply insecure about proving himself beyond the shadow of his more colourful siblings. But because Harry stood at the centre of this conflict, Percy's loyalty was painted as betrayal. Readers judged him harshly, not simply because he chose wrongly, but because he chose against Harry. This is where the unfairness begins. Characters like Cornelius Fudge, Dolores Umbridge, or even Rufus Scrimgeour clung to their pride and refused to acknowledge their failures, even when the truth about Voldemort's return stood in front of them. Fudge spread lies and manipulated the press to discredit Harry. Umbridge enforced cruelty at Hogwarts, never once admitting she was wrong. Scrimgeour, though more honourable, pressed Harry with political demands rather than admitting the ministry's shortcomings. All of these figures maintained a facade of authority, unwilling to shoulder responsibility for their blindness. Percy, by contrast, eventually did what they could not. He broke through the barrier of pride that defined so many powerful figures in the wizarding world. He came back, and he said he was sorry. The moment Percy returned to his family at the Battle of Hogwarts is one of the most striking examples of redemption in the series. J.K. Rowling describes it with characteristic poignancy in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Percy was shaking his brother, and Ron was kneeling beside them. Fred's eyes stared without seeing, the ghost of his last laugh still etched upon his face. This is the heartbreaking scene where Fred Weasley dies. Percy, who had just reunited with his family after years of estrangement, finds himself thrown immediately into the cruelest tragedy imaginable. The timing is brutal, and many readers overlook the significance of Percy's presence here. His choice to come back was not for glory, not to be hailed as a hero, but to admit he had been wrong, and the price of this decision was that he held his dead brother in his arms. The courage it took for Percy to walk back into the fold of his family cannot be overstated. To admit guilt is to strip oneself of armor, to abandon excuses, and to confront not only external judgment but also internal shame. Percy had alienated Ron, ignored Ginny, insulted his parents, and stood on the side of the ministry at a time when the Weasleys were risking their lives to protect Harry. Returning meant facing Molly's tears, Arthur's disappointment, and his siblings' anger. Yet he walked through all of it. In this, Percy displayed a form of bravery that Harry himself highlighted throughout the series. It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends. This quote from Dumbledore in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone echoes in Percy's journey. He did not stand up to enemies with a wand raised, but to his family, by lowering his defences and confessing his fault. If Harry was the spark that revealed Voldemort's return and the truth that the Ministry tried to suppress, Percy was the mirror that revealed what pride and blindness could do to an individual. Unlike others, however, Percy shattered that mirror and rebuilt himself. In this, his story contrasts sharply with someone like Fudge, who left the wizarding world in disgrace. Percy was given a chance at redemption, and he seized it. He showed that heroism does not always come from victory in combat or in grand speeches, but sometimes from the quiet but shattering act of saying, "I was wrong." Harry's role in Percy's redemption, though indirect, is essential. Because the family chose Harry over Percy, the rift widened. Because Harry embodied the truth that Percy refused to acknowledge, Percy's pride deepened. And yet, because Harry was ultimately proven right, Percy was forced to reckon with his blindness. Harry never sought Percy's downfall, but the mere presence of Harry's truth forced Percy into a position where he either clung to pride like Fudge or admitted guilt. In this way, Harry Potter became the catalyst for Percy's growth. Without Harry, Percy might have remained lost in ambition, blind to the moral failures of the Ministry. Number 16, he was a prisoner of others' expectations. Of all the Weasley children, Percy Ignatius Weasley bore the heaviest weight of expectation. He was not the eldest, yet the role of the responsible one fell onto his shoulders in ways that it never truly did for Bill or Charlie. Bill was celebrated for his natural brilliance, head boy and curse-breaker for Gringotts, a figure who combined success with a kind of rebellious charm. Charlie, equally admired, devoted himself to dragons, following a dangerous and unconventional career path. Their parents admired both paths without questioning them too deeply. But Percy did not have the same natural charisma, and his sense of order and responsibility became the foundation of his identity. The family needed someone to embody discipline and propriety, and Percy became the unwilling vessel for those unspoken expectations. This burden shaped his every choice, trapping him in an endless effort to justify his place within the family and the wider wizarding world. The shadow of Harry Potter only deepened this quiet tragedy. Harry's arrival at Hogwarts disrupted the balance in ways subtle but devastating for Percy. Percy had worked tirelessly to build his reputation, earning his badge as a prefect and later head boy, achievements that mattered enormously to him. Yet Harry, without effort, commanded the admiration of teachers, peers, and even Percy's own siblings. "Harry Potter's here," was whispered in corridors when Percy had been walking those same halls for years, unnoticed. Except for his diligence. Harry, without seeking it, became the measure against which others were judged. For Percy, who relied on recognition of his work to affirm his worth, the comparison was unbearable. When Harry entered the Gryffindor common room in his first year, Percy introduced himself with the stiff pride of a boy who needed to be respected. "I'm Percy Weasley, a prefect." It was not arrogance, but a plea to be seen. He wanted Harry to understand that he too mattered, that within the chaos of Weasley, Humetster, and Potter fame, someone was holding the rules together. But the books rarely grant Percy the dignity of being acknowledged. His siblings laugh at his formality, Harry ignores his warnings, and even the reader is encouraged to view him as comic relief. What looks like pomposity is, in truth, the shield of someone who has built his identity around duty because it is the only way he knows to stay visible. The contrast with Fred and George is especially cruel. The twins mock him relentlessly, calling him Weatherby in front of his boss, or joking that Percy thinks he's big now he's got a job at the Ministry. Readers are invited to laugh alongside them, but what we are truly seeing is a family dynamic where the ambitious child is undermined by those who embody charm and humour. Percy cannot win in such a game. When he clings to rules, he is labelled rigid. When he seeks success, he is called pompous. His siblings are allowed to rebel, to fail exams, to turn mischief into profit. Percy is not allowed that luxury because someone in the family must serve. As the responsible example, and he is trapped in that role, Harry's presence magnifies the injustice. Harry is excused for breaking rules because his rule-breaking leads to heroism. Flying a broom, when told not to, makes Harry the youngest seeker in a century, while Percy's adherence to rules makes him appear joyless. Harry sneaking into the restricted section of the library becomes daring, while Percy, spending hours in the library, becomes laughable. Harry's natural defiance is celebrated, Percy's discipline is mocked. The same system of Hogwarts values that forgives Harry condemns Percy, and once again, Percy's hard work disappears into invisibility beside Harry's effortless legend. The family's treatment of Percy during the Triwizard Tournament reveals this imbalance with painful clarity. When Harry's name comes out of the Goblet of Fire, Percy is caught between loyalty to rules and loyalty to Harry. It is very difficult to see how he could possibly have entered himself for the tournament under the rules, Percy remarks. His voice is described as stiff, his manner unsympathetic. But why should we expect otherwise? Percy has been taught all his life that rules keep order, and here was the most sacred of school rules shattered in front of him. To question the rules is to unravel the foundation of his whole identity. Instead of sympathy, he is portrayed as cold, the brother who cannot laugh with Harry in his danger. Yet his stance makes perfect sense when we see the weight he carries. If rules are not real, then all of Percy's sacrifices have no meaning. By the time Percy takes his position at the ministry, he is already isolated. The family mocks his ambition, but this ambition is his survival strategy. Cornelius Fudge offers him validation that his family never consistently gave, acknowledgement that following the rules matters, that his hard work is seen. When Fudge uses Percy as a pawn, it is not because Percy is evil or arrogant, but because Percy is starving for recognition. The betrayal of his family is devastating, but it is also tragically illogical. He chooses the only authority that seems to value him. Yet even here, Harry's shadow looms. Fudge despises Harry's testimony, and Percy sides with Fudge because to side with Harry is, once again, to be invisible. In Order of the Phoenix, when Percy writes to Ron warning him not to trust Harry, it is remembered as arrogance, but read closely, it is desperation. He says, "It's high time your loyalty was with the ministry." Behind the words lies the unspoken cry, "Choose the path I chose, choose the rules, choose the system that at least pretends to value us." Percy has wagered everything on the belief that rules and careers will bring him worth. To see Ron siding with Harry, the boy whose fame undermines Percy at every turn, is unbearable. It is not betrayal of family, Percy fears, it is the obliteration of the one fragile structure that kept his self-image intact. Even in moments of reconciliation, Percy is not offered the same redemption as others. When he returns to his family during the Battle of Hogwarts, the moment is short, almost an afterthought. The reader is encouraged to laugh again when Fred jokes, "Did you hear that, Percy?" He actually said Ministry of Magic. "I don't think I've heard you make a joke since you were—" And then Fred dies, and Percy's grief is buried under the scale of the battle. Percy loses the very brother who mocked him most, and the cruelty of this irony is immense. He is denied closure, denied the chance to show his transformation, left instead with guilt that will never leave him. Harry once again stands at the center of the story as the hero. Harry loses many, but his grief is framed in a narrative of destiny and sacrifice. Percy's grief is barely acknowledged. The books are not his story, and so his pain is background noise. But in truth, Percy's tragedy is no smaller. He is the boy who tried to live up to rules, who believed success would make him worthy, only to learn that in his world, rules mean nothing when fame and bravery are present. Percy's portrayal also highlights the way the wizarding world itself creates hierarchies of value. Hogwarts is structured to reward daring and charisma, not order and diligence. Gryffindor is celebrated for courage, Slytherin for ambition, Ravenclaw for intellect, Hufflepuff for loyalty. Yet what house celebrates the pure weight of responsibility? Percy lives as though such a house exists, but it does not. His virtues are invisible because they do not fit into the categories the story values. Harry embodies courage, Fred and George embody wit, Hermione embodies intellect, but Percy, who embodies duty, is left stranded. Even within the Weasley family, the scales tilt unfairly. Molly Weasley fusses over Harry as though he were another son, while her actual son struggles to gain her pride. Arthur, kind and distracted, admires Muggle plugs more than his middle child's meticulous efforts. Ginny, the youngest, is protected fiercely. Ron the sixth is pitied for being overshadowed. Percy, the third child, is not pitied or protected. He is expected to perform. His mistakes are not forgiven as youthful lapses, but condemned as betrayals. The double standard is impossible to miss. What makes Percy's fate especially painful is that he is not unlikable when seen without bias. His ambition, his insistence on rules, his hunger for recognition, all of these are deeply human. They are flaws born of neglect, not malice. He is not a villain, but a victim of expectations. When Harry breaks rules, he is granted understanding. When Percy clings to them, he is dismissed. The world allows Harry to be imperfect because of his greatness, but Percy is required to be perfect merely to be noticed. The burden of being the ideal son is not glory, but imprisonment. Percy lives not as himself, but as the symbol of what his family and society needed him to be. The tragedy is that nobody asked him whether he wanted that role. He bore it quietly until it broke him. And when it broke him, those around him judged rather than understood. Harry Potter's story will always overshadow his, but to look closer is to see a boy who wanted what Harry was given freely, the right to be recognized as worthy, not for destiny, not for rebellion, but simply for being who he was. Number 17. His honesty was out of fashion. Of all the Weasley siblings, Percy Ignatius Weasley is perhaps the most misunderstood and in many ways the most unfairly treated. When fans remember the Weasleys, they often highlight Fred and George's humour, Ron's loyalty, or Ginny's fiery bravery. Percy, on the other hand, is remembered as pompous, stiff, and even a traitor to his family during the height of Voldemort's return. But beneath that image lies something much deeper: Percy's unwavering commitment to honesty. He was not witty like Fred and George, not charming like Bill, nor reckless like Ron. He was a boy who said what he thought, believed in rules and structure, and refused to mask his convictions with humour or charm. That very quality, his brutal sincerity, made him an outcast both within his own family and in the broader story of Harry Potter. And at the centre of this unfairness stood Harry himself, who, without meaning to, became the reason why Percy's voice was dismissed and his honesty ridiculed. Percy's greatest flaw, if one can even call it that, was his inability to bend the truth for social acceptance. He lacked the playful ease that endeared Fred and George to everyone, or the quiet humility that made Ron's insecurities relatable. Instead, he clung to a rigid honesty even when it cast him in an unfavourable light. This trait became especially visible during the events of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Percy sided with the Ministry of Magic. Many readers interpret this as betrayal, but in truth it was a consequence of his belief in facts as he saw them. The ministry represented order, stability, and the framework of the law. Percy, being an honest rule follower, trusted that. It was not deception, it was his genuine conviction. Yet when the narrative placed Harry's version of events, emotional, dramatic, and unprovable, against Percy's grounded loyalty to the system, Percy was vilified for holding to his truth. The tension between Harry and Percy illustrates a greater cultural problem within Hogwarts and the wizarding world. Those who were quick-witted, rebellious, or charismatic thrived in the eyes of others. Harry, who frequently bent rules, broke curfews, and engaged in risky schemes, was celebrated as a hero. Even when McGonagall or Snape scolded him, admiration simmered beneath the surface because he represented courage. Percy, who refused to disguise his belief that rules mattered, was reduced to a caricature of arrogance. His honesty was not fashionable, and so it was mocked. Consider Ron's frequent remarks about Percy being a git, or Fred and George's constant jokes at his expense. These weren't merely sibling teases, they shaped how readers and other characters viewed Percy as someone undeserving of empathy simply because he refused to play along with the easygoing culture of humour and rebellion. One striking example of Percy's integrity comes in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when he defended the Triwizard Tournament rules against skepticism. While others joked or doubted, Percy stressed the importance of structure. Mr. Crouch's instructions are to be followed to the letter, Percy reminded. Many interpreted this as blind obedience, but it was also a form of loyalty. Percy was unwilling to twist words or undermine authority, even if it made him unpopular. That same honesty, however, clashed with Harry's charisma. Harry could break into a dragon, closure, sneak into the restricted section, or defy Umbridge's rules, and readers applauded him. Percy, who would have condemned such behaviour as reckless, was framed as uptight. It wasn't that Percy lacked courage, it was that courage expressed through strict truthfulness seemed boring or inconvenient in a world that prized rebellion. What makes the treatment of Percy so unfair is that his honesty was often portrayed as arrogance, when in reality it was consistency. Even when his family turned their backs on him, he did not pretend to agree with them just to maintain harmony. He stuck to what he believed, however flawed. "I'm staying where I am, and I hope you're very happy living at the Burrow with a bunch of misfits," Percy wrote in his infamous letter to Ron. Harsh words, yes, but honest. He believed his family was blinded by emotion and Harry's influence. He could have softened his stance, pretended neutrality, or remained silent. But Percy was incapable of deceit. His bluntness earned him hatred, while others who twisted the truth were admired. It is important to remember that Percy's perspective was not entirely irrational. At the time, Harry was the only one insisting Voldemort had returned, with little evidence beyond his word. The Ministry, flawed as it was, represented the collective structure of wizarding society. For Percy, trusting that system was not cowardice but honesty, believing in the larger order rather than an isolated claim. When Dumbledore backed Harry, Percy was faced with a painful choice: side with his family and embrace uncertainty, or remain loyal to the structured world he had always trusted. He chose the latter not because he sought power, but because it aligned with his values. And for that choice he was cast as a villain. Another overlooked detail is that Percy was one of the few characters who never pretended to like Harry for convenience. From the beginning, Percy's relationship with Harry was cordial but never sycophantic. Unlike others who basked in Harry's fame or used his reputation for their own ends, Percy remained distant, respectful, but not overawed. That too was a form of honesty. He refused to pretend Harry was infallible simply because everyone else treated him as special. When Harry made mistakes, Percy acknowledged them instead of glossing over them. In many ways, Percy was the mirror that Harry and his friends disliked seeing because he revealed their own hypocrisy. The injustice of Percy's treatment becomes sharper when compared to Fred and George. Their constant mischief, lies, and bending of rules were celebrated as brilliance. Readers laughed at their jokes, teachers tolerated their antics, and their siblings admired them. Yet when Percy pursued his ambition with seriousness and refused to sugarcoat his beliefs, he was labelled pompous. Why is it acceptable to deceive for humour but not acceptable to be bluntly sincere? The answer lies in popularity. Honesty rarely earns admiration, while wit disguises flaws in charm. Percy had no such disguise, and so his character was punished for what others saw as a lack of likability. Even in his reconciliation with his family during the Battle of Hogwarts, Percy's honesty shines. When he arrived and declared that he had left the ministry, he did not try to excuse his previous actions with elaborate justifications. He admitted, "I was an idiot, I was a pompous prat, I was a—" before Fred cut him off. These words mattered because they were consistent with his character, direct, unembellished, raw. He didn't hide behind excuses or soften the truth to make himself look better. That moment of sincerity, ironically, came only when war forced others to value what he had always embodied. What makes Percy's arc so tragic is that honesty rarely survives in a world that prefers palatable lies. Harry could bend the truth and be celebrated as a hero. Fred and George could manipulate situations and be admired as comic geniuses. Even Dumbledore admitted to keeping secrets, spinning narratives when it suited him. Percy, meanwhile, held on to a rigid code of truthfulness and was branded as insufferable. His honesty lacked sparkle, but it was still truth, and society, both within the wizarding world and among readers, found that uncomfortable. Percy's role also highlights how the wizarding world punished those who didn't conform to its unspoken rules of charisma. Think of how Luna Lovegood, another brutally honest character, was ridiculed as loony. Unlike Luna, however, Percy had no whimsical charm to soften the perception of his bluntness. His lack of fashionable dishonesty left him isolated. Readers can forgive Luna because her eccentricity entertains. Percy, whose seriousness demanded respect rather than laughter, received only scorn. Both characters demonstrate how honesty without charm is undervalued in a culture that worships style over substance. The truth is, Percy was not wrong to believe in structure. The wizarding world was chaotic, fragile, and corrupt. For someone like Percy, clinging to rules was a survival mechanism. His honesty was not naivety, but conviction. Yet Harry, who constantly disrupted that order, was glorified for it. Percy represented the uncomfortable reality that sometimes stability requires compromise, while Harry represented the romanticized rebellion. Naturally, the narrative sided with the latter, but in doing so it vilified Percy's honesty, turning him into a scapegoat for valuing truth over popularity. What is perhaps most unfair is that Harry himself never sought to mend the rift with Percy. While Harry mended broken bonds with Draco, Dudley, and even Snape's memory, Percy was left as a side character whose reconciliation was rushed and incomplete. Harry never recognized that Percy's so-called arrogance was simply honesty without decoration. In a story obsessed with loyalty and friendship, Percy remained a figure of distrust, overshadowed by his refusal to play the game of charm. That silence toward Percy underscores the larger theme: honesty is often invisible unless wrapped in charisma. When one rereads the series with this perspective, Percy emerges not as the villain many believe him to be, but as one of the most consistent and authentic characters. He was not perfect, but he was true. He did not hide behind wit, he did not seek to manipulate, and he did not pretend to adore Harry when he doubted him. In the end, Percy was punished for being himself, while others were rewarded for the illusions they projected. That imbalance reveals a truth more unsettling than Voldemort's rise. In both the wizarding world and our own, honesty without charm is rarely forgiven. And so Percy Weasley remains a tragic reminder that sincerity, when unfashionable, is often met with mockery. His story is not about betrayal, but about the cruelty of a culture that prizes humor, rebellion, and charisma over directness. Harry, unintentionally, became the symbol that overshadowed Percy's integrity. Where others twisted the truth to survive or entertain, Percy told it plainly, and for that he was condemned. But in a world where honesty was not in style, perhaps Percy's greatest sin was not arrogance, but the refusal to be anything less than real. Number 18, he loved his family, but didn't know how to show it. Of all the Weasley children, Percy Ignatius Weasley is the one most often painted as the stiff, ambitious outsider, the one who seemed more interested in titles and rules than in warmth or laughter. Yet if we peel back the surface and examine his story closely, it becomes clear that much of this reputation was less about who Percy truly was and more about how others interpreted him. In contrast to Fred and George, whose pranks and jokes constantly signalled affection, or Ron, whose loyalty to Harry placed him as a defender of family honour, Percy's way of showing love was subtle, intellectual, and often misunderstood. He loved his family deeply, but his inability to express that affection in the ways the rest of the Weasleys valued led to years of unfair judgment. And at the heart of this misinterpretation lies Harry Potter himself, not deliberately, but as the gravitational force who drew comparisons that Percy could never escape. Percy was a child who wanted things to be orderly, respectable, and safe, in a household bursting with chaos, an enchanted clock, exploding experiments, bewitched knitting, and twins who delighted in setting off fireworks indoors. Percy gravitated toward structure. His prefect's badge was not just a shiny ornament for him. It was a symbol that he could bring stability to his unruly environment. When he gave his siblings advice or corrected them, he was not attempting to assert cold superiority, but to protect them from the dangers of carelessness. "I don't want to interfere, but I must insist you clean up after yourselves," Percy once lectured, and while the twins mocked him, what he truly meant was that he feared recklessness could bring harm. His care was cloaked in the language of order, but that language did not resonate with his family, who heard only pompous arrogance. Meanwhile, Harry's arrival in the Weasley family's orbit magnified Percy's awkwardness. Harry quickly bonded with Ron, who offered fierce friendship and defense, while Fred and George showered Harry with jokes and gifts, treating him as a beloved younger brother. Ginny idolized him, and even Molly Weasley adopted Harry as though he were another son. Harry's place in the family highlighted every difference Percy carried. Percy's way of expressing care, through words of caution, guidance, and insistence on doing things properly, looked pale against the warmth and humour that Harry inspired from the others. Percy, standing beside this comparison, seemed colder than he really was. The unfairness became sharper as Harry's presence continually reinforced a contrast in values. When Ron risked himself in a giant chess match to help Harry, or when Fred and George abandoned rules to pass Harry the Marauder's map, the family saw sacrifice, bravery, and love expressed through rebellion. Percy, on the other hand, believed love was shown by ensuring that his siblings did not endanger themselves in the first place. "You could all do with a bit more respect for authority," he remarked, and although his words rang hollow to ears accustomed to heroics, they were born from concern. He never stopped loving his siblings. He simply believed that love meant guiding them toward safety, even if they resented the restrictions. The Ministry of Magic's shadow deepened this misunderstanding. Percy's ambition to work in the ministry was often derided as self-absorbed, yet from his point of view the ministry represented stability and a chance to provide for his family's future. Living in a house where money was scarce and hand-me-downs a constant reminder of poverty, Percy sought respectability as his way of helping. He did not craft laughter like Fred and George, nor did he guard Harry like Ron, but he envisioned a secure path that would lift the Weasleys from ridicule. His choice to support the ministry during its denial of Voldemort's return was catastrophic, but even then it was not born from malice toward his family. It was his way of saying, "I want to keep you safe by trusting in order, not chaos." To his family, this appeared as betrayal. To Percy, it was misguided protection. The distance between Percy and the others widened in moments where Harry was central. Consider the scene in the Goblet of Fire when Ron, Fred, and George immediately stood with Harry after his name emerged from the goblet. Percy's reaction was different. He insisted that Harry follow the rules and prepare for the tournament properly. "If you've got to do it, then you've got to do it right," Percy would say. The others saw this as unsympathetic, as though Percy doubted Harry, but in reality it was his clumsy way of caring. Percy was frightened for Harry and responded by emphasizing order, not by offering loyalty in the form of blind support. It was love filtered through the language of responsibility, a language his family did not speak. Harry himself never truly disliked Percy, but his presence drew lines that made Percy seem distant. The Weasley household celebrated Harry's every triumph, from his role in defeating a basilisk to his victory in the Triwizard Tournament. Each time, the warmth in the burrow glowed brighter around Harry. Percy, who had no dramatic acts of rebellion or heroism to offer, appeared increasingly alien. His advice and reminders about rules fell flat in comparison. What the family mistook as coldness was in fact Percy's failure to match the emotional vocabulary that Harry unlocked in them. When Percy finally broke from the family during the ministry dispute, his decision shocked everyone. But here too, Harry's role mattered. The family trusted Harry's version of events about Voldemort's return, while Percy, faithful to the ministry, insisted otherwise. His refusal to believe Harry was read as arrogance, when it was actually fear wrapped in stubbornness. He was clinging to the one structure he trusted, terrified that admitting Voldemort's return meant exposing his family to danger and uncertainty. His pride kept him silent, but beneath it lay the same love that had guided his every stiff admonition. He was trying to protect them the only way he knew. The reconciliation in Deathly Hallows reveals this hidden truth. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Percy appeared and declared, "I was an idiot. I was a pompous prat. I was a—" before being cut off. In that moment, his words peeled away the mask. He loved his family all along. He had never been cold or unfeeling. He had only failed to show love in the way they understood. His apology was not simply for siding with the ministry, but for years of miscommunication, for speaking a language of affection his family could not translate. Percy's story is therefore a tragedy of perception. Harry Potter's presence did not cause Percy to love less, but made the contrast between kinds of love more glaring. Fred and George's laughter, Ron's loyalty, Ginny's admiration, all looked vibrant next to Percy's rigid sense of duty. The family cherished expressions of warmth that were immediate, emotional, and visible. Percy's way, long-term planning, insistence on rules, faith in institutions, looked sterile beside Harry's glow, but within Percy's heart the fire of familial devotion burned just as fiercely. It is telling that when Fred died, Percy was right there at his side. The man mocked, for his rigidity broke down, grieving not as a detached bureaucrat but as a brother who loved deeply. He fought in the Battle of Hogwarts with ferocity, finally translating his love into the same language of sacrifice that the others spoke. But by then, much of his story had already been written in the minds of readers as the tale of the pompous sibling who put ambition above kin. In reality, Percy's failure was not lack of love, but lack of expression. If Harry had never entered the Weasley orbit, Percy might not have seemed so cold. Without the constant comparison to a boy who inspired loyalty, humour, and sacrifice from each family member, Percy's words of caution and desire for respectability might have been seen as simply another shade of Weasley affection. Instead, Harry became the mirror in which Percy's stiff expressions looked smaller, harsher, and more selfish than they truly were. Percy was unfairly cast as the outlier, not because he loved less, but because his family and readers could not read the dialect of his care. One cannot help but think of Molly Weasley's words to Harry in the Chamber of Secrets. "You must know that you're not alone, Harry." Her maternal embrace extended naturally to him, while Percy's love for his siblings manifested in corrections and reminders that they did not want to hear. Harry unlocked in Molly and the others a language of affection full of touch, warmth, and immediate support. Percy's cautious concern looked inadequate beside it. But both languages were born from the same root, love that wanted to keep others safe. In the end, Percy Weasley remains one of the most misunderstood characters in the saga. He was not unfeeling, he was not selfish, He simply loved in a way that went unheard. Harry Potter did not intend to make him seem cold, but by inspiring the family to express their love in louder, brighter ways, Harry left Percy stranded in silence. The tragedy is not that Percy failed to love, but that his family never fully understood how he was trying to say it. Number 19, he became a victim of circumstances. Percy Weasley was never the most beloved member of the Weasley family, neither by the readers nor by the characters within the story. His obsession with rules, his formality, and his relentless ambition made him stand out in sharp contrast to the warmth and humour that defined the rest of the family. Yet when examining his story closely, it becomes clear that Percy was less a villain and more a victim of the circumstances created around him. His strained relationship with his family, the coldness of his choices, and the infamous moment when he sided with the Ministry of Magic against Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore were not the product of malice but of desperation. Percy was caught in the cruelest crossfire, loyalty to family or loyalty to the only system that had ever rewarded him. From the earliest books, Percy's path was drawn differently from his siblings. Ron, Fred, George and Ginny were bound by loyalty, humour, and an instinctive defence of Harry. Percy, however, was the outlier, the prefect, the one who wore his badge like armour, the one who saw order as safety. When Harry arrived at the Burrow, Percy was already building his image, rehearsing for the future he imagined for himself. He did not have the flair of Fred and George, the bravery of Charlie, or the quiet strength of Bill. His talent was discipline, his tool was bureaucracy. In a family that celebrated individuality and courage, his devotion to structure seemed cold, yet for Percy it was survival. The fifth book, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, is the turning point of his reputation. After the Ministry of Magic under Cornelius Fudge began denying the return of Voldemort, Percy aligned himself with the official narrative. He accepted a prestigious position as junior assistant to the minister. In doing so, he effectively turned his back on his parents and his siblings. Molly Weasley was heartbroken by the estrangement, while Arthur Weasley, always patient, seemed quietly wounded. Ron and the twins were openly furious. The Weasley family became one of the most united fronts of resistance against the Ministry's lies, and Percy's choice to stand on the other side was seen as betrayal. But here lies the critical misunderstanding. Percy was only 21 years old. He was young, ambitious, and had finally received recognition in a world where he constantly felt overshadowed. The presence of Harry Potter amplified Percy's dilemma. Harry was not only the boy who lived, but also the symbolic leader of resistance. His bond with the Weasley family strengthened as the years went on, and he became like a seventh child in their household. For Molly, Harry was almost a son. For Ron, he was a best friend. For the twins, he was a partner in rebellion. To oppose Harry was to oppose the family. But for Percy, aligning with Harry meant jeopardizing the career he had fought so hard to build. The Ministry was the source of his validation, and Harry was the Ministry's greatest enemy. No matter which side Percy chose, he would lose. The cruelty of the situation is illuminated in the letter Percy sends to Ron during Order of the Phoenix. In it, Percy urges Ron to distance himself from Harry and Dumbledore, warning him that their path would lead only to ruin. He wrote, "You must be very careful about associating with Harry Potter at the moment. It could put you in real danger if you are seen with him." On the surface, this reads as arrogance and betrayal. But beneath it, one can hear the voice of a frightened young man who believes he is protecting his brother from political disaster. Percy had already made his choice and was trying, in his misguided way, to shield Ron from making the opposite one. His words may have been sharp, but they carried the weight of genuine fear. What readers often forget is how persuasive the Ministry's propaganda was during that time. Harry himself was portrayed in the Daily Prophet as unstable, a liar, a boy desperate for attention. Dumbledore was depicted as a senile old man obsessed with conspiracy. For Percy, who trusted institutions above all else, These narratives did not seem like lies, they seemed like official truth. Percy's loyalty to the Ministry was not born out of cruelty, but out of a belief that order and authority were safer than chaos. To him, siding with Harry meant siding with uncertainty and instability. For someone like Percy, who feared irrelevance and craved recognition, that choice was unthinkable. The injustice of how Percy was treated becomes even more evident when comparing him to other characters who made equally questionable decisions. Take Cornelius Fudge, who was much older and far more experienced, yet denied Voldemort's return out of cowardice. Take even Severus Snape, whose duplicity was forgiven because his story carried romance and sacrifice. Percy, however, was never offered that sympathy. His betrayal was not wrapped in grandeur or secrecy. It was mundane, bureaucratic, and easy to despise. But he was no more guilty than those who turned a blind eye until it was too late. The shadow of Harry Potter only made matters worse. Every Weasley child was measured against him. Harry brought excitement, danger, and fame into their home. Ron was lifted into adventures he never would have experienced without Harry's presence. Fred and George thrived on the chaos Harry attracted. Ginny found in him a love story. But for Percy, Harry was an obstacle. Harry's very existence undermined Percy's belief in the Ministry. Harry's rise as a hero diminished Percy's role as the family's example of success. By siding with the Ministry, Percy was, in some unconscious way, reclaiming a sense of identity outside of Harry's shadow. This is not to say Percy's actions were harmless. His rejection of his family was painful, and his absence during critical times left scars. Molly wept for him, Arthur longed for reconciliation, and his siblings carried anger for years. Yet when we look at his return during the Battle of Hogwarts, the tragedy becomes clearer. Percy arrived too late to heal the wounds, and in one of the cruelest twists of fate, he was reunited with his family only moments before Fred's death. The timing makes his story almost Shakespearean. The prodigal son returns, but the price of his absence is eternal regret. The burden Percy carried was one of impossible choice. On one side stood his family, the warmth of the burrow, the comfort of belonging. On the other side stood the Ministry, the recognition he had craved all his life, the chance to matter in a world that often overlooked him. Harry Potter, by embodying the opposition to the Ministry, forced Percy into a corner. No matter what Percy did, he would be branded a traitor by someone. If he chose Harry, he betrayed his ambition. If he chose the Ministry, he betrayed his family. He chose the latter, not out of hatred, but out of fear of losing the one thing he had built for himself. It is telling that when Percy finally reconciles with his family, he does so not through words but through action. In Deathly Hallows, he storms into the Battle of Hogwarts, declaring that he has resigned from the Ministry, ready to fight alongside his family. His transformation is not dramatic, it is humble. He admits he was wrong, that he allowed ambition to blind him, but by then the damage was already irreversible. Fred's death made reconciliation bitter-sweet, turning Percy's return into a moment marked as much by grief as by forgiveness. Percy's story is, in many ways, the story of a young man who wanted too much too soon. He wanted to stand on his own, to prove himself outside of his family's shadow. Yet the narrative of Harry Potter punished him for this desire, painting him as selfish where others were painted as noble. Readers, too, often dismiss him as the least likable Weasley, forgetting that his mistakes were made under immense pressure. Percy was not evil, he was human. He was flawed, scared, and too proud to admit it until it was almost too late. The irony is that Percy's decision mirrored the choices countless wizards made during Voldemort's rise. Many clung to the Ministry, convincing themselves that denying the darkness would keep them safe. Many ignored the warnings, branding Dumbledore and Harry as liars. Percy was simply one of them, but because his betrayal cut through the Weasley family, the heart of the story, his punishment was harsher in the eyes of readers. He became the symbol of betrayal, while in truth he was the embodiment of fear. Harry's story demanded heroes and villains, loyalty and treachery, light and dark. But Percy did not fit neatly into these categories. He was not brave enough to defy authority, nor cruel enough to serve the darkness. He was trapped in the middle, punished for his hesitation. And in this way, Harry Potter himself, by being the symbol that divided the world, was the reason Percy was treated unfairly. Percy became collateral damage in the war between truth and denial, family and career, love and ambition. His tragedy was not in being wrong, but in being too human in a world that demanded absolutes. When reflecting on Percy's arc, one cannot help but feel the weight of injustice. He was the Weasley who paid the highest personal price for choices he made too young, under pressure too great, in a climate poisoned by propaganda. His sin was ambition, his punishment was alienation, and his redemption was marked forever by loss. In the end, Percy Weasley was not a villain but a casualty of circumstance, and the story of Harry Potter shines a harsher light on him than he truly deserved. Number 20, his story is a reminder of human complexity. Percy Weasley's story is one of the most overlooked and misinterpreted in the Harry Potter saga, and much of the unfair treatment he receives, both from characters within the books and from readers themselves, can be traced back to the shadow cast by Harry Potter. Harry's presence magnifies bravery, self-sacrifice, and rebellion against authority, while Percy embodies loyalty to rules, ambition, and a belief in structure. This opposition creates a contrast so sharp that Percy is dismissed as arrogant, traitorous, or even cowardly. Yet when his story is examined closely, it becomes clear that Percy's mistakes are deeply human, and that his eventual return to his family is no less heroic than Harry's battles with Voldemort. The problem is that next to Harry's blinding narrative, Percy's journey was destined to appear smaller, harsher, and less forgivable. From the very beginning, Percy was positioned as the odd one out in his family. While Fred and George thrived on mischief, Ginny radiated affection, Ron embodied loyalty, and the elder brothers Bill and Charlie built lives of adventure and respect. Percy was different. He clung to structure and rules in a chaotic household that rarely took him seriously. His shiny prefect badge in Harry Potter and The Prisoner of Azkaban was mocked by Fred and George, who teased him relentlessly, while Harry himself became the kind of student admired without effort. When Harry broke rules, it was framed as courage. When Percy followed rules, it was framed as pompousness. In the Gryffindor common room, Harry's daring rescues earned him admiration, while Percy's lectures earned eye rolls. The stage was set for readers to view Percy with disdain, because his virtues mirrored the values of authority rather than the rebellious spirit Harry personified. A telling moment comes in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Percy is working as Barty Crouch's assistant. He takes pride in his role, describing Crouch as a great wizard and treating his job with the seriousness that his family rarely afforded him. Yet Harry, Ron, and Hermione find this laughable, mocking Percy's devotion as sycophantic. To them, Percy's hard work is not ambition but comic arrogance. The irony, of course, is that Percy was doing exactly what his family could not provide, building a career, striving for independence, and carving out a name for himself outside the Weasley shadow. In another world, his efforts might have been admired. But beside Harry, who received opportunities and recognition without even trying, Percy's diligence looked hollow. Harry's destiny made Percy's ambition look small-minded, when in truth it was simply a different form of striving. Percy's greatest fall came during the events of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Faced with the Ministry of Magic's refusal to acknowledge Voldemort's return, Percy chose to side with the establishment. To many, this seemed like a betrayal, a cold-hearted rejection of family and truth. But here again, Harry's position warped the perception of Percy's choice. Harry, who had already faced Voldemort multiple times, had no doubt of the Dark Lord's return. His courage made rejecting the Ministry's lies seem obvious. For Percy, however, Voldemort was still a shadow in stories, a figure officially denied by the only authority he had trusted. Percy believed in order, in rules, in the idea that the Ministry knew best. His error was not one of malice, but of faith in the wrong institution. The heartbreaking letter he sent to Ron, urging him to distance himself from Harry, reads as cold only because readers know Harry is right. From Percy's perspective, he was protecting his younger brother from the dangers of associating with someone the Ministry painted as unstable. It is crucial to remember that Percy was not alone in doubting Harry. The entire wizarding world dismissed Harry's warnings, labeling him a liar and a child seeking attention. What makes Percy's doubt stand out is the family context. The Weasleys, though poor, embodied warmth and trust in Harry, while Percy appeared as the outlier. But should Percy be condemned for aligning with the very institution his entire society depended upon? When Cornelius Fudge himself declared Harry unstable, Percy followed the system he had dedicated his life to. Readers condemn him not because his choice was unique, but because Harry's perspective dominates the narrative. Against Harry's truth, Percy's error feels monstrous, when in fact it was merely human. By the time of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Percy's estrangement from his family had become symbolic of his stubbornness. At Christmas, he arrives at the Burrow alongside Minister Scrimgeour, a moment that underscores his loyalty to the Ministry above his kin. The scene is heartbreaking, especially for Molly Weasley, who embraces him with tears while the rest of the family glares. But here again, Percy is treated unfairly. Readers view this moment through Harry's eyes, who sees Scrimgeour as manipulative and Percy as a pawn. What is missing is Percy's inner turmoil, the loneliness of being the outcast, the pain of choosing professional loyalty over familial acceptance. Harry's presence in that moment, glaring and narrating his disdain, seals Percy's reputation as irredeemable in the minds of many readers. Yet this was a young man trying desperately to maintain the one identity he had built for himself. Percy's eventual redemption during the Battle of Hogwarts is one of the most overlooked arcs in the series. When he returns to fight alongside his family, his first words are apologies. "I was a fool, I was an idiot, I was a pompous prat, I was a—" He admits his mistakes openly, humbly, and without excuse. This is a moment of profound bravery, because unlike Harry, who always stood on the side of truth, Percy had to acknowledge his blindness and his pride. Redemption requires a confrontation with one's failures, and Percy's moment of self-awareness carries a weight that Harry's victories never required. Readers cheer Harry's heroism, but often forget that Percy's apology and return required the kind of courage that grows out of shame and regret. In a way, Percy embodies the struggle most people face, not against dark wizards, but against their own misguided choices. The tragedy of Fred Weasley's death during that same battle underscores Percy's humanity. In the book, we are told that Percy was shaking his brother and Fred's body was limp. This is not a mere background detail, it is the culmination of Percy's arc. He left his family out of pride, but he returned to them only to lose a brother in war. The guilt of that moment cannot be overstated. Unlike Harry, who often fought and lost alongside friends, but always carried the mantle of destiny, Percy's loss was deeply personal, sharpened by the years of estrangement. The reader is meant to feel the cruelty of timing, that Percy reconciled with Fred only moments before his death. This pain shows us that Percy's punishment was not rejection from readers, but the unbearable burden of regret. When we step back, Percy's arc reminds us that not all heroes shine with the brilliance of Harry Potter. Some stumble, fall, and wander down the wrong paths before returning. His story is not about defeating evil with a wand, but about facing the darkness within one's own heart, pride, ambition, the hunger for recognition. Unlike Harry, who was chosen by prophecy, Percy chose his path, made his errors, and then chose to return. His agency makes his redemption more instructive, because it mirrors the lives of ordinary people who make mistakes and must find the courage to admit them. It is telling that J.K. Rowling chose to bring Percy back at the end. She could have left him estranged, a permanent symbol of betrayal. Instead, she allowed him the dignity of return, a narrative choice that signals to readers that even the unlikable deserve forgiveness. Percy's arc is a lesson in the complexity of human nature. He is not lovable like Ron, nor brave like Harry, nor charming like Fred and George, but he is real. He shows us that sometimes love and loyalty are hidden beneath layers of pride, and that redemption is always possible, even for those we misunderstand. Harry Potter's story, by contrast, is written in the language of destiny. He is the chosen one, his mistakes quickly forgiven, his virtues amplified by prophecy. This narrative framing makes it difficult for readers to extend grace to Percy. When Harry shouts at Dumbledore in Order of the Phoenix, we see it as justified teenage frustration. When Percy shouts about his loyalty to the Ministry, we see it as arrogance. The double standard is stark, and it is rooted in the lens through which the story is told. Harry's presence makes Percy's humanity appear as failure rather than struggle. The lesson, however, is clear. Percy Weasley embodies the truth that heroes are not always glamorous and that redemption is not always accompanied by applause. His mistakes highlight the seductive power of authority, the danger of pride, and the pain of estrangement. But his return shows the possibility of forgiveness, the strength of admitting error, and the enduring love of family. To dismiss Percy as a pompous bureaucrat is to miss the point. His arc is a mirror held up to the reader, asking whether we too might have chosen wrongly under pressure, and whether we too would have had the courage to return. In the end, the reason Percy was treated unfairly is because Harry Potter's brilliance overshadowed him. Harry's courage made Percy's caution look cowardly, Harry's rebellion made Percy's loyalty look foolish, and Harry's destiny made Percy's ambition look petty. Yet Percy's story whispers a quieter truth, that the misunderstood and the unloved also deserve respect and compassion. He reminds us that not all victories are won on battlefields. Some are won in the quiet act of admitting we were wrong and in finding the courage to walk back into the arms of those we love. Number 21, he always strived for independence. Here is a continuous 1,300-word narrative in 15 long paragraphs, written as if for a Harry Potter magazine, artistic yet clear. Percy Weasley was never truly understood, and the shadow cast by Harry Potter's arrival at the Burrow and later at Hogwarts made that misunderstanding even deeper. In a family as large and vibrant as the Weasleys, Percy struggled not to disappear among louder voices and brighter personalities. While Fred and George dazzled everyone with pranks and natural charisma, while Bill and Charlie already held the aura of being heroic older brothers, and while Ron basked in the sudden glow of being Harry's best friend, Percy was left to carve out a path that relied on diligence, structure, and ambition. For many readers, his behavior seemed pompous or cold, yet beneath that exterior was a boy desperate to prove he was not just another freckled redhead lost in the crowd. The arrival of Harry Potter at Hogwarts added an invisible but heavy pressure to Percy's life. Before Harry, Percy was known as the serious Weasley, perhaps dull, but reliable, someone teachers could trust. Yet once Harry entered the castle, the spotlight shifted dramatically. Suddenly, Ron was not just Percy's awkward younger brother, but the inseparable companion of the boy who lived. Ron's status rose overnight, and even when he failed at schoolwork or blundered in Quidditch, he was shielded by the charm of his friendship with Harry. In contrast, Percy's successes, his appointment as prefect in his 5th year, his exemplary grades, were regarded as arrogance, not achievement. The unfairness was subtle but constant. Ron's mediocrity was charming because it stood next to Harry's fame, while Percy's discipline was mocked because it lacked warmth. When J.K. Rowling describes Percy as a little pompous, she captures how others viewed him, but not necessarily who he truly was. Percy was often in the library or in the Gryffindor common room bent over parchment, perfecting essays, preparing for exams, and drafting letters. Unlike Harry, who found loyalty and admiration by simply existing, Percy had to construct his worth line by line, ink blot by ink blot. He had no natural gift to charm others, no grand destiny written into his scar. What he had was a relentless determination to make himself indispensable in a world that dismissed him as one of many Weasley. Boys. It is telling that his brothers laughed at his ambition to become Minister of Magic one day, but they never laughed at Ron's dream of Quidditch glory, despite Ron showing little evidence of the discipline to get there. Percy's prefect badge was one of his proudest possessions, and he wore it with a solemnity that others found comical. Yet for Percy it was not a trinket, it was proof that his hard work had value. Harry, meanwhile, received admiration for surviving Voldemort, for being daring, even for breaking rules. Percy earned respect only when he followed every rule to the letter, and even then that respect quickly soured into ridicule. When Harry founded Dumbledore's army and earned loyalty through rebellion, Percy's commitment to order seemed stuffy and cowardly in comparison. Readers and characters alike began to view Percy as the opposite of everything Harry represented, when in reality Percy's path was the only one available to someone without Harry's destiny or Ron's association. The unfairness of how Percy was treated becomes clearer when we recall the third book, The Prisoner of Azkaban. In it, Percy receives his head boy badge, a culmination of years of discipline. His family laughs at his pride, teasing him for his excitement. Fred and George steal the badge and mock him endlessly. Even Ron rolls his eyes. Meanwhile, Harry, in that same year, receives a brand new firebolt broomstick from Sirius Black, and instead of being teased, he is celebrated, even envied. The double standard is glaring. Harry's gift is an acceptable cause for joy. Percy's earned honour is grounds for humiliation. Rowling herself shows us this contrast, yet the fandom rarely pauses to question why Percy's accomplishments were met with scorn rather than encouragement. Percy's decision in the Order of the Phoenix to align himself with the Ministry of Magic rather than with his family is often portrayed as betrayal. But consider the world through Percy's eyes. He had clawed his way into a prestigious role as junior assistant to the minister, a position secured not by charm or family connections, but by relentless labour. Suddenly the ministry was at odds with Harry Potter, the boy whom everyone adored, and by extension, at odds with the Weasleys. Percy was faced with an impossible choice: loyalty to a family that often laughed at his seriousness, or loyalty to the career he had built from nothing. Readers vilify him for siding with the ministry, yet if Harry had been wrong about Voldemort's return, Percy would have been seen as the most responsible of the Weasleys. His decision was misguided, but it was logical for someone who had spent his life trying to escape being just another Weasley. The tragedy is that Harry's mere presence magnified Percy's flaws in the eyes of others. When Harry broke rules, it was bravery. When Percy followed them, it was cowardice. When Harry trusted Dumbledore over the ministry, it was loyalty to truth. When Percy trusted the ministry over Dumbledore, it was blind ambition. Both were teenagers, both were making decisions in a confusing, dangerous world, but the narrative tilted sympathy toward Harry and suspicion toward Percy. This imbalance created a caricature of Percy that has persisted in fan discussions: the boring brother, the bureaucrat, the traitor. Yet beneath that caricature was someone who wanted only to define himself apart from his family and apart from Harry's dominating legend. It is also important to remember that Percy did not have the luxury of rebellion. Fred and George could break rules because their wit and charisma softened consequences. Harry could break rules because Dumbledore and McGonagall shielded him. Percy, however, had no such safety net. For him, a broken rule was not a charming quirk. It was a stain on the only currency he possessed, his reputation for order and reliability. The rules were his ladder out of obscurity, to mock him for clinging to them is to ignore the narrow margins by which he lived. Ambition was not his hunger for power, but his survival strategy in a family and a world that valued charisma over consistency. The burden of being in the Weasley family cannot be underestimated. Ginny would later become Harry's wife and a professional Quidditch player. Ron was immortalized as Harry's closest ally. Fred and George built a thriving business that eclipsed Percy's bureaucratic achievements in both fame and financial success. Bill and Charlie embodied adventure and exotic accomplishment. Percy, alone, took the path of paperwork, titles, and long nights in offices. It lacked glamour, and so it lacked respect, yet it was the only way he knew to prove that his life mattered beyond being a middle Weasley child. I was determined to distinguish myself, he says, indirectly, through his actions. And while readers mock his briefcase and cauldron bottoms report, those were his weapons in the same war that his siblings fought with wands, jokes, or friendships. One of the most telling details appears in the Goblet of Fire. During the Triwizard Tournament, Percy is promoted to stand in for Barty Crouch Sr., a temporary recognition of his reliability. He takes the responsibility with utmost seriousness, yet the narrative presents him as almost laughable in his eagerness. The juxtaposition is sharp. Harry is participating in a life-threatening competition without ever asking for it, while Percy is savouring the smallest administrative responsibility as though it were glory. Yet is Percy not equally brave in his own way, stepping into the intimidating shoes of a powerful ministry official while still barely out of school? The story mocks him, but his determination in that moment speaks volumes about a young man desperate to be seen as capable. The cruelty of perception is sharpened by quotes that highlight Harry's natural charisma. In Chamber of Secrets, Rowling writes that Harry didn't go looking for trouble. Trouble usually found him. That single line encapsulates the indulgence extended to Harry. His entanglement in danger is excused as destiny. But if we apply the same lens to Percy, his relentless pursuit of recognition becomes arrogance rather than destiny. He too was not looking for scorn. Scorn found him whenever he tried to celebrate his achievements. The inconsistency reveals that the problem was not Percy's character, but the lens through which others viewed him. By the time of the Battle of Hogwarts, Percy redeems himself in the eyes of the story, reconciling with his family and fighting bravely. Yet even then, his heroism is overshadowed by Fred's tragic death, Ron's loyalty, and Harry's leadership. Percy is allowed a moment of reconciliation, but never the narrative respect of being seen as heroic in his own right. He disappears again into the background, as if the years of struggle, mistakes, and eventual courage were not enough to make him memorable. His independence was never celebrated, it was tolerated only when it served the larger story. When readers discuss Percy, they often reduce him to a cautionary tale about ambition. But in truth, his ambition was the most human of all the Weasleys. He wanted to stand alone, not because he despised his family, but because he loved them too much to be forever in their shadow. His work ethic, his loyalty to institutions, even his misjudgments, all came from a desire to be something more than a supporting character in someone else's legend. Harry Potter's fame made Percy look small, but in reality, Percy's path was one of extraordinary courage, the courage to fight for recognition in a world that never wanted to give it to him. Ultimately, Percy Weasley reminds us that not all battles are fought with wands or dragons. Some are fought with parchments, patience, and the quiet persistence of being overlooked. He was not a coward, nor a traitor, nor a joke. He was a young man who sought independence, who refused to settle for invisibility, who worked himself into exhaustion to prove that he mattered. And if his story feels uncomfortable, it is only because it reflects the hidden truth of ambition, that those who lack fame or destiny must fight twice as hard, and still, too often, go unappreciated. Number 22. His loneliness went unnoticed. Percy Weasley's story in the Harry Potter series often feels overshadowed by the dazzling personalities of his siblings and the central role of Harry. Yet, when one looks closer, his tale is one of profound solitude, a young man isolated within his own family, judged for his seriousness and dismissed as humorless or pompous. It is easy to forget that Percy, like the others, was simply trying to find his place in a household bursting with loud voices, practical jokes, and dazzling heroes. His solitude was a silent cry, but few ever paused to hear it. Even Harry, whose own loneliness defined much of his early years, unknowingly contributed to the atmosphere that left Percy an outcast. From the very first books, Percy is painted as an ambitious prefect, strict with rules, and easily mocked by Fred and George. Readers laughed along when the twins poked fun at his pompous tone, or when Ron rolled his eyes at Percy's obsession with following regulations. But beneath those laughs lies a boy who never enjoyed the same bond of laughter with his brothers. Fred and George had each other, Ron had Harry and Hermione, Ginny was adored as the youngest and only daughter. Bill and Charlie were heroes whose stories were told with admiration. Percy stood alone, known not for warmth or fun, but for being the pompous prefect. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, J.K.T. Rowling describes Percy as looking particularly smug with his head boy badge, and even his own siblings ridiculed him. Yet perhaps that smugness was more a shield than an expression of genuine pride. What often goes unnoticed is that Percy never found a companion in his siblings' hobbies. Bill, with his adventurous spirit, belonged to a world Percy could never enter. Charlie's fascination with dragons was something far removed from Percy's meticulous, rule-following nature. Fred and George, with their constant laughter and chaotic brilliance, left Percy more a target than a teammate. Even Ron, closest to him in age, preferred the company of Harry and Hermione to the older brother who seemed dull. Percy's strict demeanour alienated him further, yet it was likely born out of desperation. If he could not win affection through humour or charm, perhaps he could earn respect through discipline and achievement. Family dynamics in the Weasley household, though portrayed as loving and warm, also had shadows. It is easy to imagine Percy feeling invisible at the dinner table, where his quieter seriousness was drowned out by the noise of jokes, laughter, and arguments. His attempts to assert authority often became the butt of jokes. Fred and George once famously teased him about his secret girlfriend Penelope Clearwater and turned his attempts at privacy into family entertainment. While such moments were played for humour in the narrative, they reveal a pattern of dismissal that slowly chipped away at Percy's sense of belonging. His family did not see his strictness as a plea for recognition, but as a flaw to mock. The turning point came during the rise of Voldemort's influence, when Percy's ambition pushed him closer to the Ministry. His break with his family is often read as betrayal, but perhaps it was a final expression of the pain of being unheard. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Percy sends a cold letter to Ron warning him against Harry, writing, "It's time you learned the difference between being friends with a famous person and being friends with someone who is actually worth your while." The harshness of those words stings, but behind them lies a lifetime of Percy trying and failing to be valued for who he was. He threw himself into the Ministry because at least there, unlike at home, he believed he could earn recognition for his discipline and ambition. It is significant that Harry's presence intensified Percy's invisibility. When Harry entered the Weasley family circle, he instantly became a kind of adopted son. Molly Weasley treated him with maternal affection, Ron gained lifelong friends in Harry and Hermione, and even Fred and George admired him. Ginny was infatuated. Harry became in many ways the sibling Percy never could be, brave, beloved, and effortlessly at the centre of attention. Though Percy never openly expressed jealousy of Harry, it is not unreasonable to imagine the sting of watching this outsider win the love and admiration that Percy had long struggled to earn from his own family. This quiet rivalry explains why Percy's rejection of Harry in the 5th book was so sharp. It was not only about political alignment, it was personal. Harry symbolized everything Percy could never be within the Weasley household: loved unconditionally, forgiven easily, and admired without needing to prove himself. In contrast, Percy's achievements, becoming prefect, then head boy, then securing a ministry position, were brushed aside as arrogance or ambition. While his brothers laughed, Percy laboured for recognition, yet that labour won him only ridicule. Harry's mere existence deepened Percy's isolation. The cruel irony is that Harry, who himself knew the ache of loneliness at the Dursleys, never recognised Percy's silent suffering. Harry could have been the one sibling-like figure who understood what it meant to feel unwanted. But Harry was swept up in his own struggles and the warmth of his friendship with Ron, Hermione and Ginny. Percy was left to play the villain in a family drama where the audience had already chosen their heroes. He became an easy target because the story had no room for the boring brother. His loneliness was hidden behind an exterior of stiff pride, but loneliness, when ignored, hardens into resentment. One striking example comes in The Prisoner of Azkaban, when Percy receives a new quill and proudly shows it off. Fred and George instantly mock him, calling it Percy's new toy, while Ron smirks at the fuss. To the reader, it is a passing moment of humour, but to Percy it was another reminder that his attempts to find joy were trivialized. Even in matters as small as stationery, his siblings could not take him seriously. This constant belittling, combined with Harry's radiant presence, painted Percy into a corner where ambition became his only escape route. The narrative seldom pauses to consider how exhausting it must have been to play the role of the serious brother in a family where levity and laughter ruled. Percy was not naturally cruel or cold. He was starved of the easy affection that seemed to flow among the others. Molly Weasley adored her children, but even she treated Percy's ambition with exasperation rather than pride. Arthur Weasley, fascinated by muggled trinkets, had little overlap with Percy's world of rules and politics. Percy was left to build his identity on shaky ground, creating a mask of perfection that fooled no one but himself. When Percy finally reconciles with his family in the Deathly Hallows, the moment is powerful precisely because it reveals how long he had been waiting for acceptance. He rushes to fight alongside them, and his first words are filled with apology and relief. Rowling writes that Percy burst suddenly into the room, his face shining, his arms outstretched, as if nothing had ever gone wrong. It is almost tragic. Years of bitterness dissolve instantly once he feels welcomed again. It shows that Percy's harshness was never about rejecting his family, but about aching for their acknowledgement. He wanted to belong. His solitude could vanish in a second, given the chance. If Harry had not been at the centre of the Weasley household, perhaps Percy's efforts would have been noticed more clearly. Without the gravitational pull of Harry's heroism, Molly and Arthur might have looked more closely at Percy's ambitions. Ron might have relied more on his older brother rather than his best friend. Fred and George might have directed their jokes outward instead of inward. The tragedy of Percy is not only his estrangement, but also that his family failed to hear the silent cry beneath his rule-following, a desperate need to be seen. It is tempting to dismiss Percy as pompous, but when one considers his position within the family, a different image emerges, a lonely young man trying desperately to prove himself in a home where proof was unnecessary for others. Harry, unintentionally, became the mirror that reflected Percy's invisibility back at him. Percy's story, then, is not one of arrogance, but of alienation. He was never given the space to be vulnerable, never offered the unconditional affection so freely granted to others. His solitude was louder than his ambition, but few ever bothered to listen. In the end, Percy Weasley stands as a reminder that not all wounds are visible, and not all loneliness looks like Harry's cupboard under the stairs. Percy's loneliness lived in plain sight, hidden behind laughter, jokes, and Harry's brilliance. The Weasleys loved him, but love without understanding can feel like rejection. Percy longed for the closeness his siblings shared, but when his family turned his seriousness into a punchline, he built walls instead of bridges. His story reveals how even in the warmest families, one child can be left in the shadows, unseen and unheard. And Harry Potter, though never intending harm, became the reason those shadows grew darker. Number 23. His loyalty to duty was mistaken for pride. Percy Weasley was never the most beloved figure in the Gryffindor common room, nor even within his own family. He lacked the reckless charm of Fred and George, the bravery of Charlie, or the quiet kindness of Ginny. But what Percy did possess was something rarer, an unshakable devotion to principle. He believed in rules, in structure, in the idea that order and loyalty to institutions would lead to safety and fairness. Yet because of Harry Potter's presence in his life and the way Harry reshaped the world around him, Percy's virtues were often cast as flaws. Where Harry was praised for breaking rules and following his heart, Percy was mocked for upholding the very structure that Harry continually disrupted. His loyalty was mistaken for arrogance, his discipline dismissed as pride. From the first years at Hogwarts, Percy's behavior was interpreted in a light that favored Harry's narrative. When Percy became a prefect, he embraced the role fully, believing it his duty to set an example and ensure fairness. "I hope the others take the rulebook as seriously as I do," he once remarked proudly. But this sense of responsibility was often met with ridicule, especially when contrasted with Harry's defiance of authority. Harry could sneak out at night under his cloak and be celebrated for his daring, while Percy patrolled the halls and was accused of pompousness. What few recognized was that Percy's approach was not born of self-importance, but of his conviction that rules existed to protect students from harm, a belief shaped by his own understanding of the dangers that lurked beyond Hogwarts. As the years went on, Harry's growing fame further warped how others viewed Percy. In Harry's third year, when Sirius Black was thought to be hunting him, Percy doubled his efforts as a prefect. He patrolled late into the night, warning students of danger, trying to enforce curfews. His actions were motivated by genuine concern, yet even Ron sneered at his brother for acting self-important. Against the glow of Harry's heroism, Percy's diligence was seen as overreach, his seriousness mistaken for vanity. It was easier to admire Harry for breaking the rules than Percy for enforcing them. But Percy did not seek admiration, he sought duty. The situation reached a breaking point during Harry's 5th year, when the Ministry of Magic descended into chaos and denial over Voldemort's return. Percy, freshly appointed as junior assistant to Minister Cornelius Fudge, was forced to choose between two conflicting truths, the Ministry's authority and Dumbledore's defiance. His decision to support the Ministry has long been judged harshly, painted as betrayal of his family and arrogance on his part. Yet what if it was not arrogance but principle? Percy had spent his life believing in institutions, in the notion that the Ministry was the backbone of their society. To abandon it instantly for rumours and defiance would have been, to Percy, a betrayal of everything he believed held the wizarding world together. Where Harry trusted instinct, Percy trusted order. The letter Percy sent to Ron in Order of the Phoenix is often quoted as evidence of his pride and disloyalty. He warned Ron against following Harry's path, calling him a disturbed and dangerous young man. Readers interpret this as cruel arrogance, but it is worth remembering Percy's perspective. From his vantage point, Harry was a 15-year-old claiming the Dark Lord had returned, clashing with the Ministry at every turn, and drawing the attention of forces that endangered everyone around him. Percy's warning was harsh, but it was not born of malice. It was born of his fear that Ron would be dragged into danger because of Harry's reckless defiance of the very order Percy thought was protecting them. The tension was exacerbated by the cultural divide that Harry himself amplified. Within the Gryffindor ethos, courage meant standing against authority when it felt unjust. For Harry, Hermione, and Ron, this defined their heroism. But Percy's definition of courage was different. He believed courage meant standing by the system, even when it faltered, and doing his part to uphold its framework. In many ways, Percy was more Slytherin than Gryffindor, ambitious, pragmatic, and convinced that discipline would bring stability. Yet his sorting was not wrong. He had Gryffindor bravery. It just manifested not in rule-breaking, but in the willingness to endure mockery for his beliefs. The Weasley family dynamic also deepened the injustice toward Percy. His brothers ridiculed him constantly for his seriousness, while his parents lavished affection on Harry as though he were their own son. Molly knitted him sweaters, Arthur took him to the Quidditch World Cup, and Fred and George teased him as Saint Potter. For Percy, who worked tirelessly to stand out in a family of 7 children, Harry's arrival must have been unbearable. Harry could break rules and still be adored, while Percy followed rules and was mocked. When he sought recognition through his ministry career, it was dismissed as self-serving pride, rather than understood as the natural yearning of a neglected son desperate to prove his worth. Even Dumbledore's approach reinforced this narrative. Harry was protected, guided, and even excused for mistakes that could have cost him expulsion. Percy, meanwhile, was left to fend for himself in a system that valued rebellion over conformity. When Dumbledore publicly clashed with the ministry, Percy saw the headmaster whom he had respected, rejecting the very order Percy believed in. He was left isolated, with his loyalty cast as betrayal, and his faith in structure ridiculed as blindness. Yet this was not weakness, it was inner strength, the kind of strength that holds to conviction even when the world calls you wrong. What Percy endured during this time reveals his complexity. He was cut off from his family, alienated from his siblings, and publicly derided for his loyalty to the ministry. Still, he pressed on, continuing his work with Fudge, standing firm even when it cost him the affection of the people he loved most. This was not arrogance, it was the courage to endure exile for the sake of principle. When compared with Harry, who always had allies rallying to his cause, Percy's lonely stand is almost more admirable. Harry had the strength of unity, Percy bore the strength of solitude. The turning point came after the Battle of the Ministry, when Voldemort's return was undeniable. Percy's world collapsed in that moment, not because his beliefs were wrong, but because the institution he had devoted himself to proved fallible. His reconciliation with his family during the Battle of Hogwarts was therefore not a surrender of principle, but an evolution of it. He recognized that loyalty to institutions must never outweigh loyalty to truth. His tears, his embrace of Fred, and his desperate attempts to make amends were not the actions of a proud man finally humbled, but of a principled man who had found a deeper truth to serve. The death of Fred Weasley gave Percy's story its most tragic dimension. He fought beside his brothers, finally united, only to lose one of them forever. The moment shattered him, and in his grief he understood how unfairly he had been judged. He was not the pompous fool his family mocked. He was a man who had given everything for principle and paid the price. "Let him rest in peace, let him rest," Percy cried, and the words revealed not arrogance, but the deep love and vulnerability he had always hidden beneath layers of duty. His tragedy was not that he was proud, but that his loyalty was never understood. When we compare Percy's journey with Harry's, the injustice becomes clear. Harry was allowed to stumble, to defy, to rage, and still be admired. Percy was expected to be perfect, disciplined, and unwavering, and for that he was mocked. The wizarding world praised Harry's instinct, while scorning Percy's reason, forgetting that both approaches were necessary to fight evil. Voldemort thrived on chaos, Percy sought order. Together these qualities could have balanced each other. Instead, Percy's contributions were diminished, and his loyalty was mistaken for arrogance. One might argue that Harry himself bore responsibility for how others perceived Percy. Harry never defended him, never sought to understand his motives, and often joined in the mocking. In Goblet of Fire, when Percy became pompous about his ministry work, Harry and Ron laughed at him, dismissing his seriousness as comic relief. But what if, instead of laughing, they had seen a young man desperately trying to succeed in a world that overshadowed him at every turn? Harry's silence allowed the narrative of Percy's pride to solidify when he could have shifted it by showing compassion. Percy Weasley's story is thus one of misinterpretation. His devotion to rules was not arrogance, but faith in order. His loyalty to the ministry was not betrayal, but conviction. His warnings to Ron were not cruelty, but fear for his safety. Time and again, Percy's actions were cast in the worst possible light simply because they contrasted with Harry's. While Harry's defiance was hailed as bravery, Percy's obedience was condemned as pride. And yet, through it all, Percy remained true to himself. He did not abandon his principles, even when the world turned against him. That is not arrogance, that is the quiet strength of a man who refused to break. Number 24, his sacrifice remained unseen. Percy Weasley has long been cast as the outcast of his family, the self-important brother who turned his back on love for ambition. Yet hidden beneath the sharp judgments of readers lies a deeper truth. Percy's so-called betrayal was in fact a painful sacrifice. When he chose to side with the Ministry of Magic, it was not vanity that guided him, but the crushing belief that his family could only escape ridicule if one of them rose to respectability. To the outside world, Percy looked arrogant and cold. Inside he was fractured, torn apart by loneliness, yet unwilling to admit the weight he carried. The Weasleys had always lived under a shadow of financial struggle. Their patched robes and hand-me-down books were more than symbols of poverty. They were a constant reminder of how society dismissed them. Percy, unlike his brothers, did not find relief in jokes, sports, or reckless adventures. He chose books, rules, and order, clinging to the belief that if he could succeed within the ministry, perhaps the Weasley name would one day command respect. It is telling that even as a prefect and later as head boy, Percy walked a solitary path, often mocked by Fred and George, often dismissed by Ron, and rarely truly seen by his parents, except as the dependable one. When Harry Potter entered the Weasley family's orbit, Percy's fate changed in ways no one seemed to notice. Harry, with his fame and wealth, became an honorary son, cherished and admired by Arthur and Molly. Percy did not begrudge Harry personally, but the contrast was impossible to ignore. The boy who arrived in hand-me-down clothes of Dudley Dursley was quickly showered with gifts, affection, and even his own bedroom at the Burrow. Percy, the third son who had worked tirelessly for recognition, now found himself overshadowed by someone who had never even asked for the attention he received. This shift deepened Percy's conviction that only through hard work and career success could he carve out a place for himself. By the time of the Triwizard Tournament in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Percy had already begun to walk the ministry's path. He defended his superior, Bartemius Crouch Sr., even when it became clear that Crouch was concealing troubling secrets. "Mr. Crouch is indisposed," Percy repeated with mechanical precision, standing by the institution that gave him a sense of worth. To others, this was blind obedience. To Percy, it was loyalty to the only structure that seemed to value his diligence. His alignment with the ministry was not born of arrogance, but of desperation to believe that rules, order, and hierarchy could protect his family from ridicule. When Voldemort returned and Harry claimed that truth, Percy found himself at a breaking point. His family stood on one side, Harry's side, while the ministry demanded loyalty to another narrative. Percy made his choice, and it cost him everything. He left the Burrow, severed ties with his parents, and bore the unbearable weight of estrangement. Readers often condemn him for this decision, but few pause to imagine the silence of his new life. No laughter from Fred and George, no meals shared at Molly's crowded table, no midnight talks with Ron or Ginny. He walked away from warmth into isolation, telling himself that dignity would be worth the cost. The tragedy of Percy Weasley is that he never admitted how much he suffered. His pride was armor, his rigid speech a mask that hid the storm inside. He presented himself as confident, striding into the ministry with his head held high, but inside he mourned the loss of his home. When he arrived at the Burrow during the Christmas of Order of the Phoenix, only to deliver a message from the ministry that insulted Harry, it was a wound deeper than any curse. He could not stay, could not collapse into his mother's arms, could not speak the words, "I miss you." Instead, he left again, colder and more alone than before. In truth, Percy's sacrifice mirrored Harry's own. Both were young men forced to choose between comfort and duty, between what they loved and what they believed was right. Harry often received recognition for his sacrifices, praised as the chosen one, while Percy was reviled as a traitor. Yet the essence of their suffering was the same. Both endured loneliness for a cause larger than themselves. Harry's cause was the truth about Voldemort. Percy's was the belief that his family's honor could be restored through allegiance to the Ministry, flawed though that institution was. His was the quieter, less glamorous burden, but no less agonizing. When Molly Weasley cried over Percy's absence, the family grieved for a lost son. But did they understand what he had lost? Percy lived in a bare flat with none of the chaos and joy of the Burrow. He ate meals alone, celebrated no birthdays, received no letters filled with warmth. Every night, as he set aside his ministry paperwork, he must have thought of the Burrow's flickering lights and the sound of Ginny's laughter drifting from the garden. Yet he endured, convincing himself that one day his sacrifice would be recognized as loyalty of another kind. Percy's return to his family at the Battle of Hogwarts is often cited as his redemption, yet the depth of that moment is rarely explored. He did not simply admit he had been wrong, he revealed that years of silence had carved wounds into him just as deep as those borne by his family. "I was a fool," he confessed, and in that confession lay the collapse of years of pretense. His brothers welcomed him with forgiveness, but one must imagine the tidal wave of emotion within him, the relief, the shame, the longing finally unleashed. The laughter he shared with Fred, cut short by tragedy, was a reminder that he had paid a heavy price for his misguided loyalty.